In the frozen trenches outside Pokrovsk, something unprecedented is unfolding. For over 2 centuries, Russia counted on one unbeatable ally in war, an ally that crushed Napoleon's Grand Army, an ally that broke Hitler's Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow. That ally was General Winter, the brutal cold that devastated every force that dared invade Russian soil. But in January 2026, that ancient alliance has shattered. Russia is the invader now, and General Winter has switched sides. Ukrainian military intelligence reports confirm what seemed impossible just months ago. The same freezing temperatures, the same unforgiving conditions that saved Moscow from conquest are now killing Russian troops by the hundreds. While Ukrainian defenders shelter in fortified positions with heating and supplies, Russian assault forces freeze in open fields, undersupplied and abandoned. This isn't just a tactical setback. This is history reversing itself. I'm Nora Blake, and you're watching Nora Blake. If you want to understand how one of warfare's oldest patterns just broke, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't find this analysis anywhere else. The situation is developing rapidly. According to statements from Ukraine's 7th Army Corps on January 23, 2026, Russian offensive capability in the Pokrovsk sector is beginning to degrade. The culprit isn't just Ukrainian firepower, it's the combination of harsh weather and what Ukrainian officers call systemic neglect of troop welfare. In temperatures plunging to -14 degrees Celsius in the early morning hours, the difference between prepared defenders and exposed attackers becomes life and death. And right now, Russia is on the wrong side of that equation. Pokrovsk sits at a critical junction in Ukraine's Donetsk region. It's a logistics hub, a fortified city, and for over 18 months, it's been Russia's primary objective in eastern Ukraine. The Institute for the Study of War confirms that seizing Pokrovsk has been the Russian military command's main operational goal in Donetsk Oblast since February 2024. Despite deploying an estimated 165,000 troops to this sector, despite suffering catastrophic casualties that Ukrainian sources estimate at 15,000 in January 2026 alone, Russia has failed to take the city. As of late January 2026, Ukrainian forces from the 7th Army Corps continue to hold defensive positions in the northern sectors of both Pokrovsk and nearby Myrnohrad. These are the settlements Russia repeatedly claimed to have captured throughout late 2025. Those claims were false. While Russian forces did enter portions of Pokrovsk in late 2025, controlling an estimated 67% of the ruins by December, Ukraine maintains critical positions. The city hasn't fallen. What changed in January? The answer lies in the thermometer. Winter arrived with force across the Donetsk region, and with it came a reality that Russian military planners either ignored or couldn't solve. Attacking forces, especially infantry moving on foot across open ground, become exponentially more vulnerable when temperatures drop below freezing. Ukrainian forces operate from established positions. They have shelters, heated areas, stockpiled supplies, and crucially, stable logistics, allowing troop rotation. Russian assault units have none of these advantages. Volodymyr Polevy, head of strategic communications for Ukraine's 7th Army Corps, laid out the situation in stark terms on January 23rd. Operational data and intelligence assessments indicate that Russian offensive potential is beginning to degrade. Adverse weather conditions combined with systemic disregard for personnel welfare are among the key contributing factors. This isn't Ukrainian propaganda. Independent analysis from the Institute for the Study of War corroborates these findings, reporting that Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Pokrovsk direction on January 24th and 25th, but did not make confirmed advances. Understanding what's happening at Pokrovsk requires understanding the mechanics of winter combat. Cold weather doesn't discriminate between armies, but preparation does. For defenders in fixed positions, winter is manageable. You dig in, you fortify, you stockpile fuel and supplies before the freeze arrives. For attackers crossing open terrain, winter becomes an enemy as deadly as bullets. Every military in history has learned this lesson. Russia is learning it again. Ukrainian positions around Pokrovsk benefit from months of preparation. Defensive fortifications include not just trenches and bunkers, but infrastructure for survival, heating systems, insulated shelters, food storage, medical facilities. These aren't luxuries in minus 14-degree weather. They're the difference between a functioning combat unit and a group of hypothermic soldiers waiting to die. Ukraine's supply lines remain operational, enabling regular resupply and troop rotation. Fresh units cycle in while exhausted ones cycle out, preventing the accumulation of cold weather injuries. Russian forces attacking Pokrovsk face the opposite scenario. Multiple reports confirm that assault units often advance on foot without vehicular support, carrying only what individual soldiers can transport. In summer, that might mean ammunition, rations, and basic gear. In winter, it means impossible choices. Carry more ammunition or more cold weather equipment? Bring extra food or fuel for heating? For soldiers attacking across frozen fields toward fortified positions, there are no good answers. The tactical implications are severe. Soldiers cannot dig frozen ground to create fighting positions. Any attempt to light fires for warmth creates infrared signatures visible to Ukrainian drones kilometers away. Movement becomes difficult as cold saps energy and slows reflexes. Hypothermia and frostbite don't wait for battles to end. They accumulate hour by hour, degrading combat effectiveness long before enemy contact. Ukrainian officers report that many Russian assaults in January have devolved from coordinated attacks into disorganized attempts by already weakened forces. The storms have become dribbles in military parlance. To understand the significance of what's happening, we need to look backward. The concept of General Winter as Russia's ally isn't propaganda. It's documented military history spanning 3 centuries. The personification of Russia's brutal climate as a military commander dates to the early 1700s during the Great Northern War, when Swedish King Charles XII invaded the Russian Empire with 35,000 troops. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was the most severe of the 18th century. By spring, only 19,000 Swedish soldiers remained. Russia won the subsequent Battle of Poltava in June 1709, ending Swedish dominance in Northern Europe. 100 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte repeated the mistake on a far larger scale. His Grand Army of 610,000 men invaded Russia in June 1812, advancing through what is now Belarus toward Moscow. Russian forces retreated, burning crops and villages in a scorched earth campaign. Napoleon reached Moscow in September, but the city was abandoned and burning. By the time the French retreat began in October, Napoleon's army had been reduced to 100,000 men. Winter finished what disease and combat had started. Freezing temperatures, lack of supplies, and constant harassment by Russian forces destroyed what remained. The disaster shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The most famous example came during World War II. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941 with over 3 million German soldiers. Initial advances were devastating. By October, German forces stood within 12 miles of Moscow. Then winter arrived. German forces lacked winter uniforms, winterized vehicles, or adequate supplies for a prolonged cold weather campaign. Russian counterattacks, reinforced by Siberian divisions equipped and trained for winter warfare, drove the Wehrmacht back from Moscow. The Eastern Front became a frozen hell where more German soldiers died from exposure than from Soviet bullets in some sectors. The myth of German military invincibility died in the Russian winter. In all 3 examples, Russia was the defender. Invading armies advanced into Russian territory, overextended their supply lines, and met the combined force of Russian resistance and catastrophic weather. General Winter worked for Russia because Russia was fighting on home soil with adapted tactics and equipment. The pattern held for centuries, until now. What makes the situation at Pokrovsk historically significant is that Russia now plays the role of the attacker. Russian forces are the ones advancing across hostile territory. They're the ones stretching supply lines. They're the ones trying to take fortified positions while exposed to the elements. This isn't defending Moscow. This is attempting to conquer Ukrainian cities in winter, and the tactical realities are unforgiving. The irony isn't lost on military analysts. Ukraine now benefits from the defensive advantages that Russia historically exploited. Ukrainian forces hold prepared positions. They have interior lines of communication and shorter supply routes to their rear areas. They can stockpile supplies and rotate troops efficiently. Russian forces, meanwhile, must conduct offensive operations in the same conditions that broke Napoleon and Hitler. The difference is that Ukraine, unlike France or Germany, is adapted to these exact weather conditions. Ukrainian soldiers are fighting in their own climate zone, on their own terrain, with growing Western support for cold weather gear. Volodymyr Polevy articulated this role reversal in his January 23rd statement. He noted that General Winter is traditionally portrayed as a force that helps Russia defeat its enemies, mentioning Napoleon, Hitler, and, in a sardonic aside, allegedly democracy itself. But in the current conflict, the cold is working against the offensive. For troops on the offensive, especially without vehicular resupply, all available equipment is limited to what a soldier can carry. For assault units, frost acts as a force multiplier for existing problems. Russian soldiers are pushed into open terrain without proper winter equipment, and with no intent to sustain them. The tactical calculation is brutal. Ukrainian defenders can afford to prioritize ammunition and weapons because their shelter and heating are already in place. Russian attackers must choose between combat effectiveness and survival equipment. They chose wrong, or more accurately, their commanders chose for them. Reports from Ukrainian forces describe Russian soldiers attacking with inadequate winter gear, limited rations, and no realistic evacuation plan if wounded. In military terms, they're being fed into a meat grinder. The only difference is that now the grinder includes sub-zero temperatures. The under-equipment of Russian forces isn't a new development, but winter makes it catastrophic. Multiple reports from throughout the conflict document systemic failures in Russian military logistics. As far back as December 2022, CNN reported that Russian soldiers were resorting to crowdfunding to obtain basic gear like boots and body armor. Equipment that should be standard issue was instead being supplied by families and supporters back home through donation campaigns. 2 years later, those problems haven't been solved. They've been compounded by casualties, corruption, and the sheer scale of Russia's mobilization. Ukraine has claimed that many Russian soldiers, particularly in certain sectors, including areas north of Pokrovsk, are being sent into battle without body armor or helmets. The Telegraph reported in late 2025 that on the Lyman front, only 4 out of 20 attacking groups were observed wearing helmets. If accurate, this represents catastrophic leadership failure. Helmets protect against shrapnel, debris, and fragmentation that causes the majority of battlefield injuries. Going without them doesn't just endanger soldiers. It guarantees higher casualty rates for no tactical benefit. In winter, the equipment failures become exponentially more deadly. A soldier without proper winter clothing in -14-degree weather isn't just uncomfortable. He's a medical emergency waiting to happen. Frostbite begins affecting extremities within minutes of exposure. Hypothermia sets in as core body temperature drops. Combat effectiveness degrades rapidly as coordination fails, and decision-making becomes impaired. These aren't abstract medical concepts. They're the reality facing thousands of Russian soldiers ordered to attack Ukrainian positions in January 2026. Russian military logistics appear unable or unwilling to address these deficiencies. There are several possible explanations, none of them flattering to Russian command. First, corruption and theft within the supply system may be diverting equipment before it reaches frontline units. Second, Russia's mobilization of hundreds of thousands of additional soldiers in 2024 and 2025 may have overwhelmed the supply system's capacity. Third, and most damningly, Russian commanders may simply not prioritize soldier welfare when planning operations. Based on casualty figures and tactical patterns observed throughout the war, the third explanation appears most likely. The statistics are staggering. According to Ukrainian General Staff data analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces suffered 416,570 casualties throughout 2025. This averages to over 34,000 casualties per month. For the Pokrovsk direction specifically, Ukrainian sources reported 7,000 Russian soldiers killed in action in January 2026 alone, with total casualties estimates ranging from 14 to 15,000 for the month. To put this in perspective, that's more casualties in one sector in 1 month than the United States suffered in the entire Iraq War from 2003 to 2011. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Each casualty represents a Russian soldier who was sent into combat, often with inadequate training, equipment, and support. Multiple sources confirm that Russia is increasingly relying on older recruits, foreign volunteers lured by high pay, and convicts promised freedom in exchange for service. Mediazona reported in December 2025 that the most frequent age of death among confirmed Russian casualties is between 46 and 52 years old. These aren't elite troops in their physical prime. They're middle-aged men sent to storm fortified positions in sub-zero weather. The evacuation and medical support situation appears equally dire. The Center for European Policy Analysis noted back in June 2024 that evacuating or even treating wounded soldiers is far from a priority for the Russian military. Soldiers aren't taught basic first aid. On the battlefield, they cannot treat themselves or help wounded comrades. Injured soldiers may wait days or weeks for evacuation from trenches, assuming help arrives at all. SIPA's analysis found that more than 5% of potentially salvageable soldiers are dying when they could have been saved with proper medical care and evacuation. Now add winter to this already catastrophic situation. A soldier wounded in summer might survive hours or days waiting for evacuation. In -14-degree weather, that same soldier dies from exposure in hours or less. The combination of inadequate medical support and brutal cold creates a death trap. Ukrainian sources describe this reality with grim efficiency, reporting cases of Russian soldiers freezing to death from minor wounds that would be survivable in temperate weather. Russia's systemic failures in soldier welfare, already documented throughout the war, become mass casualty events when combined with general winter. While Russian forces struggle against winter, Ukrainian defenders benefit from preparation and support. Western nations, particularly the United Kingdom and Canada, have supplied hundreds of thousands of winter uniforms and equipment items. The British Defense Ministry confirmed shipment of 195,000 winter clothing items, while Canada provided approximately 500,000 winter uniforms. This isn't charity, it's strategic investment in Ukraine's ability to maintain defensive operations through the winter months. Beyond equipment, Ukraine has structural advantages in the Pokrovsk sector. The city sits behind layers of defensive fortifications constructed over months of preparation. These aren't improvised positions. They're engineered defensive lines designed to channel attacking forces into kill zones while providing Ukrainian troops with protected firing positions, supply routes, and fallback positions. The Institute for the Study of War notes that Ukrainian defenses have significantly constrained Russian advances, forcing Russian forces to attack at a walking pace even when weather conditions are favorable. Ukrainian logistics also function more effectively than Russian supply lines, at least in sectors like Pokrovsk, where Ukraine maintains control of rail lines and highways running west. This allows for efficient resupply and troop rotation. Fresh units can relieve exhausted ones regularly, preventing the accumulation of cold weather injuries and combat fatigue. Russian forces attacking from the east through contested territory lack these advantages. Their supply lines run through areas under constant Ukrainian artillery and drone attack. The psychological factor also matters. Ukrainian soldiers are defending their own country, their own cities, in many cases their own homes. That's a powerful motivator that doesn't fade when temperatures drop. Russian soldiers, many of them mobilized against their will or lured by increasingly desperate economic incentives, lack the same intrinsic motivation. Military historians have long recognized that defender morale typically exceeds attacker morale in prolonged conflicts, all else being equal. When you add the reality that defenders are warm and supplied while attackers freeze in open fields, the morale gap becomes a chasm. Pokrovsk represents one sector of a 1,000-kilometer front line stretching across eastern and southern Ukraine. While this analysis focuses on how winter affects the Pokrovsk battle, the broader strategic situation matters. Russia made minimal territorial gains in 2025 despite catastrophic casualties. According to Institute for the Study of War analysis, Russian forces captured 4,831 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025, amounting to just 0.8% of Ukraine's total territory. This came at the cost of over 400,000 casualties. Those numbers reveal a brutal reality. Russia is trading approximately 78 soldiers per square kilometer of captured territory. For comparison, that's more casualties than the United States suffered per square kilometer during the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific in World War II. And those battles involved some of the bloodiest combat in American military history. The rate is unsustainable by any rational military calculation. Yet Russia continues. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russian forces failed to achieve their stated objectives for 2025. Moscow prioritized capturing all of Donetsk Oblast and creating buffer zones along Ukraine's northern border. As of January 2026, Russia controls approximately 67% of Pokrovsk, but not the entire city. It has not seized all of Donetsk Oblast. The buffer zones in northern Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts remain contested. Measured against its own goals, Russia's 2025 offensive failed despite unprecedented casualties. Ukraine, meanwhile, maintains control of approximately 80% of its pre-2022 territory. This includes the entire western half of the country, all major population centers except those in occupied Donbass, and critical infrastructure, including the capital Kyiv. Ukraine also maintains its August 2024 incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, though Russian forces have recaptured significant portions of that territory. The strategic stalemate continues, but winter is adding a variable that favors the defender. The question military analysts are asking is why Russia, with its historical experience of winter warfare, cannot adapt to these conditions when attacking Ukraine. The answer involves multiple factors, including strategic overextension, economic constraints, corruption, and fundamentally flawed assumptions about Ukrainian resistance. Russia's military-industrial complex can produce missiles and artillery shells. It cannot produce motivated, well-equipped infantry willing to freeze in Ukrainian fields for objectives they don't understand. Russia's economy provides a partial explanation. While avoiding total collapse, Russia faces significant constraints. Labor shortages across all sectors, including defense industries, mean that older, less capable workers are building weapons while younger workers are sent to fight. Inflation remains high. Economic growth has slowed despite massive war spending. The combination limits Russia's ability to both sustain military operations and maintain adequate equipment and supply levels for hundreds of thousands of deployed soldiers. Corruption compounds these problems. Russia's military logistics have long suffered from systematic theft and fraud at every level. Equipment disappears from warehouses. Supplies are sold on black markets. Funding intended for soldier welfare is embezzled by officers and contractors. This isn't new, but war exposes it ruthlessly. When a soldier freezing in a trench discovers that the winter clothing he was promised was never purchased because someone stole the funding, that soldier's effectiveness and morale both plummet. Multiply that by tens of thousands of soldiers, and you have systemic failure. The most fundamental problem may be strategic. Russia's military operates under assumptions that worked when defending Russian territory, but fail when attacking fortified positions in a neighboring country. Russian military doctrine has historically accepted massive casualties in exchange for tactical objectives, assuming that Russia's larger population and industrial base would outlast opponents. That calculation worked against Napoleon and Hitler because they were invaders who eventually had to retreat. It doesn't work against Ukraine, which isn't going anywhere and receives sustained Western support. Ukrainian forces aren't simply enduring winter, they're exploiting it. Military analysts note that Ukraine has adapted its tactics to leverage the advantages winter provides to defenders. Drone operations, which depend on visibility and operator comfort, become more effective when defenders can operate from heated positions while attackers struggle with exposure. Artillery can be pre-positioned and supplied via protected routes, while Russian artillery must constantly displace to avoid counter-battery fire while in exposed positions. Ukraine's use of surveillance and reconnaissance drones in winter creates additional problems for Russian forces. Any heat source shows up clearly on infrared sensors. A group of Russian soldiers attempting to warm themselves around a fire becomes a target within minutes. This forces Russian troops to choose between freezing in silence or revealing their positions and inviting drone strikes. Neither option supports effective offensive operations. Ukrainian forces, operating from fixed defensive positions with heating infrastructure, face no such dilemma. The psychological warfare aspect also matters. Ukrainian forces have released multiple videos and reports documenting Russian casualties from cold weather. This serves several purposes. It demoralizes Russian troops and their families. It encourages Russian soldiers to surrender or desert rather than freeze. And it reinforces to Ukrainian soldiers and civilians that their defensive strategy is working. Every frozen Russian soldier represents one less attacker attempting to break through defensive lines. International support for Ukraine remains stable through early 2026, despite concerns about potential changes in American policy. European nations have pledged continued military and financial aid. The United Kingdom, France, Poland, and Baltic states particularly have maintained strong support. This allows Ukraine to plan for sustained defensive operations through the winter months, confident that ammunition, equipment, and supplies will continue flowing westward. A particularly telling development emerged in early January 2026. United 24 media reported that Russian officers deployed on the Pokrovsk front line were increasingly submitting formal requests for reassignment to rear positions or quieter sectors. This isn't desertion in the legal sense. These are official requests through military channels. The fact that officers are willing to risk disciplinary action and career damage rather than continue commanding troops in Pokrovsk conditions speaks volumes about morale and conditions. Russian military command has reportedly responded to these requests with threats of disciplinary action and demotion. This solves nothing. Threatening officers who can no longer function effectively doesn't make them function effectively. It just ensures they will remain in position while doing the minimum necessary to avoid punishment. Effective military organizations recognize when units need rest, reconstitution, and relief. Forcing exhausted, demoralized officers to remain in deteriorating conditions produces the exact opposite of combat effectiveness. The broader pattern suggests a Russian military leadership that has lost touch with frontline realities. Staff officers in heated headquarters can draw arrows on maps showing where units should attack. They cannot conjure warm clothing, adequate supplies, or motivated soldiers through force of will. The gap between planning and execution in Russian operations has grown throughout the conflict. Winter makes that gap catastrophic. Orders are issued. Units attempt to comply. Soldiers freeze, attacks fail, and the cycle repeats with fresh units until they too are degraded by exposure and casualties. Historical examples abound of military organizations that refused to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The First World War provides numerous examples of generals ordering attacks despite overwhelming evidence that those attacks would fail. Russia's performance in Afghanistan in the 1980s showed similar patterns of repeating failed tactics. The current situation in Ukraine, particularly around Pokrovsk, suggests Russian military leadership has learned nothing from these examples. The same failed offensive tactics continue, now with the added burden of conducting them in winter against a prepared, motivated defender. Looking at verified data provides a sobering picture. The Institute for the Study of War, analyzing Ukrainian general staff reports, confirms that Russian forces suffered 416,570 casualties in 2025 alone. This doesn't count casualties from 2022 through 2024. Total Russian casualties since February 2022 exceed 1 million killed and wounded, according to British Defense Ministry estimates from October 2025. These figures cannot be independently verified since Russia classifies all casualty data, but they align with estimates from multiple Western intelligence agencies. In exchange for these casualties, Russia captured less than 1% of Ukraine's territory in 2025. The rate of advance in 2025 averaged 13.24 square kilometers per day, marginally higher than 2024's rate of 9.87 square kilometers per day. But these averages mask wild fluctuations. November 2025 saw peak advances of 20.99 square kilometers per day. October saw only 8.8 square kilometers per day. December dropped to 15 square kilometers per day. The pattern suggests Russian advances depend on weather windows when Ukrainian drone operations are degraded by fog, rain, or snow. For the Pokrovsk sector specifically, Ukrainian sources reported 15,000 Russian casualties in January 2026 alone, including 7,000 killed in action. If sustained, that casualty rate would mean 180,000 casualties per year in a single sector. Russia's total military is estimated at approximately 710,000 troops, according to Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky. The mathematics are simple. Russia cannot sustain current casualty rates indefinitely without either mass mobilization beyond what has already occurred or accepting strategic failure. The territorial control data tells the other side of the story. Despite Russian gains, Ukraine still controls approximately 80% of its internationally recognized territory as of January 2026. This includes all of Western Ukraine, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, and other major cities. Russian forces control approximately 20%, much of it captured in the initial weeks of the February 2022 invasion rather than through the grinding 2024-2025 offensives. Measured against Putin's apparent goals of regime change in Kyiv and effective control of Ukraine, Russia has failed comprehensively. The winter battles around Pokrovsk may represent a turning point, not because of tactical victories or defeats, but because they reveal fundamental truths about the conflict. Russia cannot achieve its objectives through current methods. Ukrainian defenses, supported by Western aid and leveraging natural advantages including winter weather, can prevent Russian breakthroughs indefinitely. This creates a strategic stalemate, but one that favors Ukraine's long-term position. Winter 2025-2026 has exposed the limits of Russian military power more clearly than perhaps any previous phase of the war. An army that cannot adequately equip and sustain its soldiers in winter conditions is an army that cannot win wars of conquest in Eastern Europe. Russia's historical reliance on General Winter as a defensive asset has blinded its military leadership to the reality that Winter is neutral. It advantages defenders. In Ukraine, Russia is the attacker, and Winter punishes attackers without mercy. The broader geopolitical implications extend beyond Ukraine. NATO members, particularly in Eastern Europe, are watching Russian performance closely. The degradation of Russian military capability through sustained attrition in Ukraine reduces the threat Russia poses to other neighbors. This isn't abstract analysis. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania are making defense planning decisions based on observed Russian weaknesses. The myth of Russian military superiority has been shattered comprehensively. For Ukraine, the winter battles provide both relief and no illusions. Relief because Russian offensive operations are degraded, providing time to reconstitute defensive lines and prepare for spring operations. No illusions because Russia shows no signs of seeking meaningful negotiations or accepting Ukrainian terms for peace. The war will continue beyond winter. Ukrainian defensive success in Pokrovsk and other sectors buys time, but doesn't end the conflict. That will require either Russian collapse, which appears unlikely in the near term, or negotiated settlement, which requires concessions Russia has refused to make. The frozen battlefields of Pokrovsk tell a story that would have seemed impossible to military historians just a few years ago. Russia, the nation that defeated Napoleon and Hitler partly through the brutal advantage of winter warfare, now watches helplessly as those same winter conditions destroy its offensive operations in Ukraine. General Winter hasn't betrayed Russia. Russia has placed itself in the position where winter becomes the enemy by choosing to attack rather than defend. By failing to equip its soldiers adequately, and by pursuing military objectives it lacks the capability to achieve. As January 2026 continues, the pattern seems likely to persist. Ukrainian defenses hold. Russian attacks continue, but without decisive success. Casualties mount, and winter claims victim after victim among Russian troops sent to attack in conditions they cannot survive. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Russian forces continue offensive operations in the Pokrovsk direction, but day after day, those operations produce no confirmed advances. That's the reality of warfare in winter when attackers face prepared defenders. This isn't the end of the war. Russia will continue fighting through winter and beyond. But the events at Pokrovsk have demonstrated something crucial. Russia cannot defeat Ukraine through brute force offensives that disregard soldier welfare and basic military logistics. Every frozen Russian soldier, every failed assault, every request from officers to escape the front line proves this reality. Military power isn't measured just in tanks and missiles. It's measured in an army's ability to sustain operations under harsh conditions while maintaining soldier morale and combat effectiveness. By that measure, Russia is failing. If you want to stay informed about these developments as they continue to unfold, subscribe to Nora Blake. Hit that notification bell. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening in Ukraine. The conventional wisdom about Russian military power is dead. It froze to death in the fields outside Pokrovsk. The question now is how long it will take Russian leadership to accept that reality. Until then, the grinding attritional warfare continues, and general winter fights for whoever is defending their homeland. Share your thoughts in the comments below.